Number 1.
This story is from the point of view of a female. This happened to me last year. Myself and about 8 other friends were heading to our prom's after party in a rented limo. I was going through my phone to show a friend a recent selfie. Before coming to a stop at a red light, I had just turned to hand my friend the phone when I heard a loud squeal of tires behind us. My friends and I all gasped, assuming that we had almost been rear-ended. But not 3 seconds later, we heard 2 loud slams as the driver and passenger got out of the car behind us and stormed up to our windows. My friend Natalie immediately hit her face as the 2 men tried to pull on the door handles, which fortunately were locked. They pounded on the window and began screaming and cursing for Natalie to open up. The 3 of us immediately dialed 911 on our phones, and another girl started screaming at the limo driver to move. One of the guys smashed his elbow repeatedly against the window in an attempt to break it, the whole while screaming like a madman at Natalie, demanding she open the door. I tried taking a video on my phone, but it didn't come out very well, and doesn't show very much. The screams of the 2 guys are drowned out entirely by the girls shouting inside, and visually, it's mostly just a jumble of dresses and cell phones in the dark. The guys were both dressed like they had just rolled out of bed, wearing baggy sweatpants and wife beaters. One of them had a cigarette behind his ear, and both of them were clearly much older than we were. The light was still red when the limo driver stepped out of the car and yelled at the 2 thugs to back the fuck off. He was a big, intimidating guy, and I felt slightly better knowing that he would probably make them back off. Amazingly, however, they didn't. One of the guys squared off with him, while the other continued pounding on the glass with his elbow. The window cracked and then broke, showering us with fragments of glass. The guy reached in and unlocked the door, and then physically tried to pull Natalie from the car by her ankles. Us girls all leapt up and started attacking this guy with our high heels, and one of us, I'm not sure who, ended up cutting his eye. The next guy ended up getting shoved backwards by the driver into the oncoming traffic lane, and a Chrysler took the corner too quick and smashed directly into him, sending him flying over the roof, and he ended up landing on the pavement. The driver held the first guy down until the police arrived, and the mess shut down the entire intersection. A few of the girls were sobbing and hyperventilating. But since I was studying to become a med student, I had been the one to climb out of the limo first, and concluded that the guy who had been hit by the car didn't have a pulse. We were forced to stand on the sidewalk for over an hour as the police took our statements, and the scene was closed off with police tape for the crime investigators to examine. Needless to say, we never made it to the after party. Natalie later told us that the first guy was her stepbrother, and the second guy turned out to be his dealer. She had found his stash hidden in a place where her baby nephew could have easily found it, and she destroyed it. He had apparently found out and was coming to take revenge on her. The dealer was dead before the paramedics arrived, and the stepbrother was rushed to the hospital where he ended up losing his eye before being arrested. He had damaged his arm pretty badly in the process of breaking the window. Our driver was found not at fault for the accident with the dealer, but the driver of the Chrysler lost his license. Looking back, it was definitely the most terrifying few minutes of my life, and I can't get over how even though this whole event took place over maybe 5 minutes, it seemed to last an eternity. I still have the shoes I wore from that night, and they're still stained with the dealer's blood. I haven't worn them since.
Number 2.
Back in 2012, I was on my way to prom with a girl that I had only been dating for a few weeks named Sophie. We hadn't attended the same school, but we were the same age and lived in the same neighborhood. I had met her casually through another friend, and we had been drawn to each other based on our mutual love for anime and graphic novels. I asked her to prom mostly to introduce her to my school friends. I figured I would raise a few eyebrows and make quite a few other guys jealous, because we lived in a very conservative town, and this chick was decked out in tattoos and always wore this cool-looking scorpion necklace. I drove down the street to her house to pick her up on prom night. She climbed into my car wearing a very revealing tight black dress, and she made my jaw drop. Before heading to prom, we stopped by one of my other friend's house, who was having kind of a pre-party bonfire in his backyard. There were about 12 people there, and we all sat around the fire passing around a flask and smoking some cigarettes before getting ready to head out. One of the guys that was there was this arrogant prick that I recognized from the previous year. His name was Patrick, and he had attended the same school as me before he flunked out. He had been invited to prom by one of the girls in my class. Patrick kept trying to engage in conversation with Sophie, despite his own date being right there on his arm, and Sophie just kept blowing him off or just flat out ignoring him. After a few minutes, we all stood up, and Patrick moved to get between Sophie and myself. I was about to tell him to fuck off, when Sophie pulled out a switchblade from nowhere and held it to Patrick's throat. She then told him that if he ever made to touch her again, she would cut open his windpipe. Patrick nearly wet himself and skulked off like a coward. A few of my friends laughed it off, but most of them looked very concerned and afraid. When we reached the school, we were informed that Sophie wouldn't be allowed to enter the dance. Word had reached the chaperones about her pulling a knife on Patrick, and given that she wasn't a student there, she was refused admittance. The two of us returned back to the parking lot and headed towards my car. Sophie seemed disgruntled but ultimately apologetic, and told me that it would be fine with her if I dropped her off and headed back. I told her that it was fine and I would rather spend the night with her, and we planned to go out and grab a bite to eat. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car and shut the door, waiting for her to walk around the far side of the car and climb into the passenger seat. I put the key in the ignition and started the car. After about 10 seconds, I started glancing around looking for her. She wasn't anywhere outside the car. I opened the door and got out, scanning the area for her. There were no other cars driving off or pulling in, and while there were more than a dozen cars surrounding us, there was no sign anyone was inside any of them. I called her name and started walking through the parking lot, searching between cars. I called her cell phone and even went back inside the school to search the bathroom. She had literally been right behind me when I entered my car, and it would have taken her maybe 5 seconds to walk around the other side. Immediately, I began thinking the worst, like perhaps someone had grabbed her and driven off with her, but I would have heard car doors slamming and seen a car speeding off. I remembered how she had drawn the knife on Patrick and assumed that she had been attacked, but she could have easily defended herself. After over an hour of searching, I called the police, who didn't take me very seriously until they ran her information and discovered that she had been arrested numerous times for vandalism and shoplifting. When I told them about her pulling a knife on Patrick, they sent an officer to the school, and he interviewed everybody who had been at the bonfire. After another hour or so, 2 more officers arrived and began searching the parking lot. One of them found her knife plunged into a tire of a Honda at the far end of the lot. The car belonged to a substitute teacher who wasn't even at the dance and had never even met Sophie. The police were unable to find any sign of foul play and concluded that she had likely left on her own, abandoning me when she discovered that she couldn't get into the prom. It's been over 5 years, and that explanation has never sat right with me. In my gut, I feel like she was kidnapped. I don't know how or why, but that's the only thing that made sense to me. To the best of my knowledge, her parents never filed the missing persons report. Her full name is Sophie Odette Osmond, and she would be around 24 by now. While she has numerous tattoos of anime characters and loopy cursive texts, her most notable tattoo is a great white shark down her left forearm. I have no idea if she's still alive, or even going by that name anymore. Looking back, I really wish I had done the whole chivalry thing and walked around the car to open the door for her.
Number 3.
Back in 2006, I was attending my senior prom back in my hometown in Nebraska with a female friend of mine. We weren't dating, and our relationship was strictly platonic, but we had been guilt-tripped into going by our other friends, and just decided to go together. My friend's name was Cora, and she was very tall and thin with an athletic build. While she wasn't considered a knockout by most of the guys in my class as far as her looks, she was extremely talented on the basketball court, incredibly book smart, and could always be relied upon for a vulgar joke. The majority of the night, Cora and I just sat at one of the tables in the corner and made small talk with our fellow classmates, exchanging laughs and talking about our plans for college. When the night was nearly over, one of my other friends confided in us that some of the other students had smuggled a few 12-packs of beer into the basement and were quietly indulging before the night ended. Cora and I separately made our way downstairs to the cobweb-infested basement to find about 6 other male students sitting in a circle and throwing back beers, passing a bottle opener around and smoking cigarettes. Most of the guys Cora and I knew and trusted, so we sat down and each had a beer. I planned to have no more than 2, as I didn't want to return upstairs reeking of beer and appearing too buzzed. Some of the guys had clearly already had more than that, as they were slurring their words and talking louder than was necessary. Cora and I talked to one of our friends about possibly meeting up later that night at a dinner, when Cora received several text messages in rapid succession on her phone, which she had in a pocket under her dress. Glancing at her phone, she excused herself and walked back over to the stairs for some privacy. I stayed and opened my second beer, still enjoying myself and talking with my friends. I didn't notice until about 15 minutes had passed that Cora hadn't returned yet. I stood up and began making my way back upstairs towards the gym when the fire alarm began wailing. It wasn't just a bell, it was a siren that shrieked loud enough to make your teeth rattle from any corner of the school. I sprinted back upstairs and was nearly trampled by people running from the gym towards the exits. I would have followed them immediately, but I wanted to find Cora first. Even though we weren't dating, she was still my friend, and I had invited her, and I felt like her safety was my responsibility. Her dress was a bright yellow color, and given that she was as tall as most of the guys, I figured that I would be able to spot her pretty quickly in the crowd, but I didn't. I opened the door to the women's bathroom and called her name, then ran to the hallway where her locker was, still unable to find her. Figuring that she had probably made it safely outside, I decided to make my way out to the parking lot, but something just didn't feel right. As far as I could tell, there was no actual fire. I didn't notice any smoke or could smell anything burning. Deciding to cover all my bases now that I was relatively sure that this was just a prank, I ran back downstairs to the basement, and thank God I did. Back in the basement where we had been sitting, Cora was on the ground, with a figure I didn't know standing over her. His hands were around her throat. I sprinted over and smashed a beer bottle directly over his head, causing him to lose his grip and stagger backwards. Cora took a deep breath as I made to help her up, but the attacker grabbed at me. I remember his eyes being so bloodshot that they were almost completely red, and his pupils were enormous. His face was lean and haggard, and his mouth was curved slightly at the edge, like he was getting a sick thrill out of all this. Cora threw a punch into his throat that he didn't see coming, and caused him to gag and fall over again. I grabbed her around the waist and heaved her into the air as best I could, and physically dragged her up the stairs, her still trying to get at the creep while he was down. When I reached the parking lot, the cops immediately surrounded me, assuming that I was assaulting her. But after I explained the situation, Cora was immediately loaded into an ambulance and taken to the hospital. I told the police about the guy in the basement and assumed he was a student that I just didn't recognize. But all these years later, whoever I saw has yet to be identified. The police grilled me with questions about the guy, but it all happened so quickly that I couldn't even remember what he was wearing. It was never determined who pulled the fire alarm, as there was no fire. But Cora and I suspected that it was this stranger. Cora had no idea who he was either, and speculated that when she ran back downstairs to look for me, he had emerged from hiding. Perhaps just looking to throttle the first person he found. That is all just speculation though. I have no real explanation. Maybe he was just some strung-out drug addict who had been hiding down there for hours. All I know is, for as long as I live, I'll never forget those leering, hateful eyes and that sickly, gratified smirk.
Hey there, you wanna go to the prom with me? There's always a reason to be afraid.